Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to begin a series on all the different spell changes in the Dungeons & Dragons 2024 new rule set. Of course, all of those have been in the player's handbook for quite some time. I personally haven't had the time to either watch videos of other people covering all the changes or kind of dig into them myself, so this is sort of my project of doing that. We're going to do 2 tiers of spells at a time because there's just so many spells to go through. There's like 97 in this video alone. It should go pretty quick because there aren't great changes to all the different spells, so we should be able to kind of pop through them. Today we're going to cover the cantrips and first level spells, then we'll follow by the second and third, then fourth and fifth, sixth and seventh, eighth and ninth. So these videos probably should get shorter as we go on since there's just fewer spells and probably fewer changes to go through as well. But before I get started with that, if you are a new viewer to this channel or returning viewer and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting it either now or at some point during this video if you like what you see. We're in that final stretch towards 1,000 subscribers, so that's very exciting. But yeah, we have a lot to go through today, so let's go ahead and get started and start with our cantrips. So starting off kind of strong here with Acid Splash, we see that the school has changed from Conjuration to Evocation. This notably makes it so that the Empowered Evocation, the level 10 feature from Evocation Wizards, would now apply to this spell, which is also pretty powerful because it now targets a point within range rather than targeting 2 specific creatures. And I recently did a video on all the shapes of the different spells and how that works. And so we know that a point within range refers to an intersection of squares, specifically the corners of a group of squares. So that it's effectively a 10-foot cube, so you could potentially hit 4 small or medium creatures in that area, whereas the 2014 version of the spell was only ever limited to up to 2 creatures. I think this is a situation where it's clearly better than the 2014 version. Moving on to Blade Ward, we can see that the duration has changed from 1 round to 1 minute with concentration. I will say combat cantrips with concentration don't really thrill me most of the time. Previously, this just granted you resistance to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage from weapon attacks. This now causes all attacks against you for the duration to subtract 1d4 from the attack roll, so it's kind of like a temporary bonus to your armor based on the 1d4 per attack roll. So it is kind of a buff in a way that it affects all attack rolls against you, not just attack rolls from weapon attacks. And it's also kind of a buff because it doesn't care what the damage type of that attack is, so it can affect more different kinds of attacks, such as different spell attacks and things like that. So this does now apply to more things. So while losing the flat resistance from this might seem bad, I do think that this is maybe overall more usable. I don't know that I'd pick it up on the vast majority of characters, but I think, you know, Eldritch Knights can definitely use this because they can replace one of their attacks with a cantrip, so they can attack once and then cast Blade Ward to give them a defensive boost, especially if they're using a shield. Same could be said for Bladesong Wizards or even the Valor Bard if they're able to pick this up. They all have that ability to cast a cantrip as in place of one of their attacks. So for any defensive oriented character, maybe in a low stakes combat where you don't want to use one of your big spell slots on a concentration spell, you can just use this for defensive measures and, you know, try to reduce how many hit points you lose in that combat. I think that's a perfectly acceptable use of this spell. Shout out also to War Magic Wizards who get a bonus to their AC while concentrating. I think originally the Bonfire spell was the only sort of offensive or combat oriented concentration cantrip, so now they would also have access to Blade Ward, and of course the effect of Blade Ward would then stack with the extra bonus armor class from the level 10 War Magic Wizard feature. Moving on to Chill Touch, this is kind of the first change that I'm not really super happy with. This was previously one of my favorite cantrips pre-2024. It had long range, decent damage, pretty great secondary effect of when it was relevant. And they technically only changed one of those things, but I think it kind of changed it for the worse. So we can see that the range here was reduced from 120 feet to touch. The duration was changed from 1 round to instantaneous, although that doesn't really affect anything. Of course, this now requires a melee spell attack rather than a ranged spell attack. It did increase the damage from 1d10 necrotic damage from 1d8, so I guess that's fine. However, it also no longer gives undead disadvantage on attack rolls against you for the round that it's active. You just prevent creatures from regaining hit points when you hit them with this. You know, I understand the sort of the meme that Chill Touch was sort of a weirdly named cantrip because it neither does cold damage nor is a touch spell. You know, it still doesn't do cold damage, but they did change it to a touch spell. I don't know if they did that for that reason because of the sort of meme of people talking about it this way, or if they thought that the ability to prevent someone from healing was just too powerful that it needs to be a melee ranged spell. If that's the reasoning for it, I guess I get it. However, again, this was one of my favorite cantrips. I think this is probably one of the most underrated cantrips just because of how powerful being able to stop healing is. But it is what it is, and because we always have the choice to just ignore this and continue using the 2014 version if we'd like. I know personally, if I'm building a pure spellcaster, I'm probably going to pick up Shocking Grasp for a touch range spell because of the defensive utility for it. I guess if you're trying to build a melee ranged caster, much like the Eldritch Knights or Bladesong, they could use this more offensively. Again, it is what it is, but let's go ahead and move on. Moving on, we have Dancing Lights. So this has had a school change from evocation to illusion. Notably, this would allow the illusion wizard to cast this without verbal or somatic components. And then it had a small material change where it used to include the option of witchwood or a glowworm, but then now it only uses a bit of phosphorus. Not a big change, but it is a change if you care about that sort of thing. Moving on to Druidcraft, this has had no changes. It just has a easier to read format change. Eldritch Blast has been changed slightly, that it can now target objects in addition to creatures. This is mainly to prevent it from being a minesweeper for things like mimics or other creatures that look like objects when they're standing still, like cloakers. I think even ice mephits look like icicles, essentially. So previously, rules as written, you could use Eldritch Blast to target chests, and if it wasn't a mimic, then nothing would happen. But if it was a mimic, then you could shoot an Eldritch Blast at it. Can't do that anymore in the 2024 rules with this change. Now we have Elementalism. This is actually a new spell in 2024. It's sort of a combination of different other spell effects that are based on different elements. So we can see Beckoning Air. It creates a breeze strong enough to ripple crofts, stir dust, rustle leaves, or open doors and shutters, all in a 5-foot cube. Or you have Beckon Earth, where you can create a thin shroud of dust or sand that covers a 5-foot square. Or you can cause a single word to appear in your handwriting in a patch of dirt or sand. Beckon Fire, you can create a thin cloud of harmless embers or colored scented smoke in a 5-foot cube, and that lasts for 1 minute. You also have Beckon Water, that creates a spray or cool mist that lightly dampens a 5-foot cube. Alternatively, you can create 1 cup of clean water either in an open container or on a surface, and that evaporates after 1 minute. And then finally, you have Sculpt Element, where you can cause dirt, sand, fire, smoke, mist, or water that can fit in a 1-foot cube to assume a crude shape, such as that of a creature for 1 hour. So you have all these kind of different effects. It's sort of, again, like I've mentioned it in several different videos, that it's basically like a elemental themed prestidigitation. So if you want something along those lines, if any of this interests you, you can certainly pick up this new spell. Moving on to Firebolt, this now applies the burning hazard to objects that aren't being worn or carried. The burning hazard, again, it's considered a hazard, not a condition, so to speak, but it basically just means that that object takes 1d4 fire damage at the start of each turn until it is put out using an action. Friends has undergone some pretty significant changes, although it's still kind of the same spell in essence. So we can see that the range has increased from self to 10 feet. It requires a wisdom saving throw now, whereas previously it had no save against it. It specifically applies the charmed condition from just having advantage on charisma checks against a certain creature. The creature succeeds automatically if they aren't humanoid, if you're fighting it, or if you have cast the spell on them within the last 24 hours. It ends early if the target takes damage, or if you make an attack roll, deal damage, or force anyone to make a saving throw. So if you cast this on a creature, you can basically just talk to them and do nothing else. The target still knows it is charmed by you, but is no longer automatically hostile, at least according to the spell's text. Your DM might, of course, rule otherwise, but it is no longer part of the text of the spell that they're automatically hostile to you afterwards. And the material opponent used to specify that you put on the makeup that you're using when you cast the spell if you were using the specific material component, but it no longer says that. I think these changes are pretty good. It is more in line with kind of other charm effects and how they work, and maybe makes the spell feel a little more usable, since you're not necessarily automatically making an enemy, and you can maybe play with the way that you're trying to charm that creature in a way that's maybe a little more honest. Enchantment spells in general can be a little problematic, so you definitely want to be careful with how you're using this, because you still might make an enemy when you use it, but you have a little more leeway now. Moving on to Guidance. Guidance has had a slight change here, although it's still effectively the same spell. You now have to choose a specific skill that you want to apply the bonus to when you cast the spell. Then the affected creature adds that 1d4 bonus to every ability check that they make during the duration that uses that skill. So whereas previously this just affected the next ability check, and it could affect any ability check that they made, you instead are just choosing one specific skill, and then they can make repeated uses of that skill for the 1 minute duration of the spell and still get the bonus on every one of them. So this is better in the sense that it can affect repeated checks when necessary, especially if that person is going out of your range. Although it's maybe worse in the sense that it can't affect generic ability checks, such as, just like a generic charisma check, or it can't affect things like initiative or other, generic ability checks like that. It specifically has to be using a specific skill. Moving on to the Light Cantrip, this is no longer considered to have a 20-foot radius or area. It is just a touch spell. It now targets a large or smaller object instead of an object that is no larger than 10 feet in any dimension. Can't target any object that is being worn or carried by someone else. And on that same note, you can't force that dexterity saving throw that you used to apply light to something that is being worn or carried by someone else. It does mention that the spell ends if you cast it again, although they removed the text that says you can dismiss this as an action. And you'll notice as we go through different spells, a lot of spells have this text removed, and in each time I'm going to say that the spell duration rules in the player's handbook now say that any ongoing spell effect that you created, you can dismiss without using any sort of action. So for example, with light, you no longer need to use an action to dismiss it. You can just dismiss it at any time if you want without using any sort of action. On that same note, moving on to Mage Hand, like I said, it no longer says it can be dismissed as an action, but again, the spell duration rules say that you can do that freely now. The description of the spell also specifies that you can use the Mage Hand the turn that you cast the spell, and then additionally using the hand on later turns specifically requires the magic action, whereas it was previously just a regular action before. Moving on to the Mending Cantrip, this cantrip is unchanged. Mind Sliver, one of my favorite cantrips personally. This was added to the player's handbook from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. There's some flavor text changes, but this is mechanically unchanged. The Minor Illusion cantrip is again one of those cantrips that previously said it was able to be dismissed as an action, but again, the spell duration rules say that you can do that without any action. And it now specifically requires the study action to investigate an illusion, and you'll see that trend throughout other illusion spells as well. Moving on to Poison Spray. Poison Spray had its range increased to 30 feet from 10 feet. It was changed from the School of Conjuration to the School of Necromancy, so notably this qualifies it for the Reaper feature of the Death Domain Cleric, where you can kind of fork it to another creature. And it now also requires a ranged spell attack instead of a Constitution saving throw. So it is sort of a shorter range cantrip at 30 feet rather than like the 60 feet or 120 feet of other range cantrips, but it does do a d12 damage. It does do poison damage, so you do kind of need to make sure that you're targeting the right kinds of creatures with this, because we know how poison damage is. We're still waiting for the monster manual for 2024 to see if they change how many immunities there are to poison damage. Moving on to Prestidigitation, this is completely unchanged. Reduce Flame has had some pretty huge quality of life changes. So first, it is now a bonus action to cast up from an action. It sheds Bright Light and Dim Light in a 20-foot radius each, so 40 feet total, much like a torch. This is up from a 10-foot radius each. It no longer states it can be dismissed as an action, but again, we know from the spell duration rules that you can now do this freely, requiring no action. And the flame now lasts for the duration, and it can now be repeatedly used to throw fire as a magic action on the turn that you cast it, as well as subsequent turns without needing to recast it. So previously you had to use an action to cast this, and then you had to wait till your next turn to then attack with it, but then when you attacked with it, you lost that fire and you would need to recast it to do it again. Now it's acting a little bit more like the Fire Flower from Mario, where it just lasts for the 10 minutes, and during that 10 minutes, you can just keep throwing fire without losing the fire that you conjured in the first place. So it's kind of like a combination between Light and Firebolt, though it has a shorter range than Firebolt and does a little bit less damage. Moving on to Ray of Frost, this one is completely unchanged. Resistance has been completely overhauled, so you now choose a damage type when you cast the spell, and the affected creature reduces damage of the chosen type by 1d4 once per turn during the duration, and this is a concentration spell. This used to be sort of the saving throw version of Guidance, where you'd get a 1d4 to your next saving throw during the duration. The fact that this only applies once per turn kind of makes it bad. I don't know that I like this one at all. I think I'd rather have the old version, especially because this is only once per turn, so it doesn't even affect repeated sources of damage. The damage die doesn't scale at all with cantrip level. I think that would be a decent change to try to make this a little bit more usable. They actually had a version during the UA that it was a reaction within 10 feet when someone failed a saving throw, that you could give them the 1d4 bonus to that save to try to allow them to make that save instead. I really feel like they should have kept more in that vein with Resistance. I really don't like this one at all. I think I'll probably either continue using the current version or use the Unearthed Arcana version, because that one was just so much better. Moving on to Sacred Flame, it now specifies that the target has no benefits from half cover or 3 covers cover regarding the saving throw. Previously, it just said that the target gains no benefit from cover for the saving throw. I think this is kind of always what they intended, because one of the lesser remembered effects of cover is that you also get the bonus of cover to your dexterity saving throws as well as your armor class. So it's not necessarily that the spell ignores cover, it just ignores that bonus to saving throws from those kinds of cover. Moving on to Shillelagh. This has had some pretty impressive changes, so this now has a range of self instead of touch. The damage can be force or the normal weapon damage instead of the normal generic magical damage. The damage die scales with cantrip level, and the material component no longer includes the shamrock or includes the club or quarterstaff necessary to use the spell. It just has the mistletoe, if that matters. I do think that this is a really good change. I do wish they would have gone maybe a step further and allowed this to apply to any club or quarterstaff that you're holding, so that you can dual wield them, and they could have even limited it so if you are dual wielding while Shillelagh's active, you only have the d8 damage die, similar to how the unarmed fighting style is limited to a d6 damage die if you're holding something else. It's still very good the way that it is, and I think it's worth building around if you're trying to do that for certain classes, but I just really wish they would have gone that little step further. Moving on to Shocking Grasp. The main change here is that the creature can't make opportunity attacks rather than not be able to make reactions, and you no longer have advantage on creatures that are wearing armor made of metal. Notably, the reaction part was changed because legendary creatures in 2024, we've seen with like the Vecna stat block that the legendary actions are becoming legendary reactions, so they don't want a cantrip being able to lock out such a powerful creature of such a powerful feature. I don't personally like the removal of the advantage against creatures wearing metal armor or made of metal even. I'll probably still include that if I'm the DM and if I remember to do so, but I think this is still overall just a fine spell. Moving on to Sorcerous Burst, this is a new cantrip specifically for sorcerers. It's an evocation spell requiring an action against a creature or object within 120 feet. It has verbal and somatic components. It is a ranged attack roll that deals 1d8 damage of your choice of acid, cold, fire, lightning, poison, psychic, or thunder. So very modular damage. If you roll an 8, you can roll that die again and add it to the total, and then this can occur a number of times equal to your spellcasting ability modifier. It is odd to me that it says a ranged attack roll and not a ranged spell attack roll. I think that is a typo. There's nothing about this spell that would suggest to me that they intend for it to use like dexterity because it's a range, just a generic ranged attack roll. Pretty sure that's just an oversight. Again, I do like the exploding dice mechanic where if you roll the max amount on that dice, then you get to roll again and add it to the total. Exploding dice aren't a statistically significant damage increase, but it's another way to think about it is basically like another chance to critically hit in a way. So you have a 5% chance to critically hit on the attack roll, and then you have a 12.5% chance to explode on any one of the d8s. So level 5, the chance to explode at least once between the 2d8 is 23.4%. At level 11 with the 3d8, it's 33%. And at level 17 with the 4d8, it's about 41%. And then if you crit at level 11 or higher when you have 3d8, the chance to explode at least once with 6d8 is about 55% chance. And then if you crit at level 17 or higher when you're rolling 4d8 for a total of 8d8, that is a 66% chance to explode at least once. And again, you can explode a number of times on any given damage roll, a number of times equal to your spellcasting ability modifier. And of course, the chances of exploding a certain number of times in a row are actually pretty abysmal. But it does, again, have this sort of like gamblish fallacy sort of hype to it where when it does happen, it's going to feel great. So if you've had a chance to use this and you've had any great successes with it, as far as like having the perfect roll where you're able to roll, explosions, 3 times, 4 times, even 5 times in a row, let me know down in the comments. I'd be interested to know what that story was like and how much damage you did. Again, I really love exploding dice, even if it's not like a mathematically powerful thing. I think it's just very fun. And that combined with the modular damage type to be able to like snipe certain vulnerabilities or weaknesses like trolls and their regeneration, that sort of thing. I think it's a very, very powerful spell. I think if you're a sorcerer, you'd be sort of remiss not to pick this one up. Moving on to Spare the Dying, its range was increased to 15 feet from touch, and now targets a creature that isn't dead rather than a living creature with 0 hit points, and it no longer excludes undead or constructs. Moving on to Starry Wisp, this is a new cantrip for bards and druids. It basically works like a single target 1-round fairy fire. You make a ranged spell attack, and on a hit, they take some damage. They shed dim light in a 10-foot radius, and they can't benefit from the invisible condition until the end of your next turn. As for Thaumaturgy, much like Druidcraft, this only had some formatting changes, but it's mechanically the same. Likewise, Thornwhip had some minor wording changes, but is mechanically the same. Thunderclap is now considered an instantaneous emanation, although it's mechanically identical. 5-foot radius emanation is different from a 5-foot sphere in the sense that you would measure from the edge of the square that you occupy rather than the intersection of squares that you would for a free-floating sphere. This makes it so that a 5-foot radius emanation on a medium creature is effectively a 15-foot cube with the emanating creature at its center. From a top-down perspective, it would look something like this, with the creature at the center being the source of the emanation, then it affects everything within 5 feet of them. Moving on to Toll the Dead. This was added to the Player's Handbook from Xanathar's Guide of Everything. The only real change here is that it now specifies that the sound is audible within 10 feet of the target. Otherwise, there's been no change. True Strike has been basically completely reworked to be kind of a special sort of blade-like spell, similar to like Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, although it's mechanically different in a number of ways. It requires a somatic and material component. The material component must be a weapon you're proficient with that's worth at least 1 copper. When you make this special attack as part of this cantrip, you specifically use your spellcasting ability modifier. Instead of strength or dexterity, you don't have the ability to choose. You have to use your spellcasting ability modifier. The damage type can be either radiant or the weapon's normal damage type. And then at higher cantrip levels, it will deal extra damage. This is a pretty exciting change. Of course, it's much, much more usable than the old True Strike. It has a lot of potential power with different builds, so I think there's a lot of videos on that already. If I do build videos in the future, I'll probably touch on things like that, but it's definitely worth looking into. Moving on to Vicious Mockery, you can now target a creature you can see or hear within range. Previously, you could only target a creature you can see. Additionally, the damage die was increased from 1d6 from 1d4. And then moving on to the last of the cantrips, we have Word of Radiance. This was added to the player's handbook from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Much like Thunderclap, this is now an instantaneous 5-foot emanation. So similarly, it affects that same 15-foot cube with the emanating creature at the center. There's a small material component change to be a Sunburst token instead of a holy symbol, if that would matter to you at all. But this is still mechanically the exact same spell that it always was. It just had some minor rule changes to use the new emanation rule rather than the more generic text. So starting with our first level spells, we have Alarm. The range now specifies that this is a 20-foot cube, but otherwise this is mechanically unchanged. Animal Friendship no longer requires that the beast be able to see or hear you, and also no longer requires that the beast have an intelligence of less than 4 for this to work on them. You'll see this pattern on other similar spells that interact with beasts. Armor of Agathis maybe has some controversial changes, and I think I was kind of on the fence with these at first. The good change here is that it now requires a bonus action instead of an action, so it is much more usable in combat, which is great. That second sentence now does just say that you gain 5 temporary hit points, whereas previously it said you gain 5 temporary hit points for the duration of the spell. And it also says that it ends early if you have no temporary hit points, rather than while you have these hit points, as in these hit points that were granted by the spell. And also there was a small material component change where it's a shard of blue glass rather than a cup of water. The controversy that exists around the spell, if you aren't already aware of it, is that it says the spell ends early if you have no temporary hit points, whereas previously this says while you have these hit points, these things happen. So basically what the implication here is that as long as you have any temporary hit points for the duration of 1 hour, you can continue using the benefits of this spell. So for example, if you had 1 temporary hit point left from the 5 temporary hit points, and then someone cast a spell on you like Polymorph that gave you a bunch of temporary hit points, people are like, okay, wouldn't Armor of Agathis end because you lost the hit points from that spell? But because they both changed the second sentence where it says you have 5 temporary hit points for the duration of the spell, and they changed that last sentence as well to say that the spell ends early if you have no temporary hit points. One of those things where it's like, okay, if they changed it in one sentence, I might think that was a mistake or maybe an oversight that they didn't think about. But if they changed it kind of in 2 places, I think that's more intentional. And I also think in order to gain enough temporary hit points to really make this spell last longer, you have to invest a very large resource like a level 4 spell slot for a Polymorph. If you're just using something like False Life or some other thing that gives you like a little bit of temporary hit points, that might make the spell last 1 more hit, but I don't think you're going to get a lot more out of it unless you're investing, again, a large resource to do so. So I'm fine with it working the way that people are reading it. If you've seen any official commentary from designers that says otherwise, definitely let me know down in the comments. But the way I read it, I agree with the people's interpretation that you can refresh hit points from other sources to keep this spell going, as long as you're within that 1 hour duration. Moving on to Arms of Hadar, this is now a 10-foot emanation. Mechanically, this is unchanged. It always had this sort of same effect. Notably, a 10-foot emanation is effectively a 25-foot cube with the emanating creature at the center. Notably, something cool about this one is that it still says that they can't take reactions if they fail the saving throw, or at least until the start of their next turn. So this would work against the new legendary reactions for creatures, and this is a strength saving throw, so not all legendary creatures will have good strength saves. If you kind of pick up on that, you could potentially either take reactions away from them for a certain while to give your team a reprieve from their legendary reactions, or you're going to force them to burn one of their legendary resistances to make sure that they can keep using them. Moving on to Bane, this one was unchanged. Bless is mostly unchanged, although it had a weird material component change where it was previously a sprinkling of holy water to a holy symbol worth 5 or more gold. This would technically prevent characters from casting this spell with a different kind of spellcasting focus, since it now has a specified cost associated with it. Burning Hands, the only change here is that it now applies the burning hazard to flammable objects that aren't being worn or carried, much like the Firebolt spell. Charm Person now ends early only if you or your allies damage the target rather than doing anything harmful, so it specifically needs to be damage. You could technically do other things that might be considered harmful, but as long as it doesn't do damage, I guess it's technically fine. And now it specifically uses the friendly keyword instead of just them regarding you as a friendly acquaintance. A character that is friendly towards you or your party basically gives you advantage on charisma checks with them. Additionally, when you upcast a spell, it no longer requires the additional targets to be within 30 feet of each other, so they just have to be within range of the spell when you cast it. Chromatic Orb was changed to have the ability to bounce to additional targets if you roll the same number on 2 or more of the d8s when you're rolling for damage, and then it can bounce additional times if you upcast it. I have a whole video that I'll link somewhere in the tags or whatever on this video. Maybe I'll link it down in my description also, that covers everything to know about Chromatic Orb and the chances for it to bounce and the odds of things happening and things like that. It's a very fun spell now. It can potentially do a lot of damage, and for sorcerers specifically, or any caster that has advantage on their attack rolls, especially if you can get Elven Accuracy going, there's a lot of things that you can do with this one that it's almost like, it can almost act like a level 1 Chain Lightning if you get really lucky. So it's a pretty exciting spell. I'm not going to say it's the most powerful spell ever, although it does have a very high ceiling. Moving on to Color Spray, this is now an instantaneous duration, whereas previously it was considered 1 round. It is now a con save rather than affecting a certain number of hit points, similar to the old Sleep spell, and it no longer has any upcasting scaling. Moving on to Command, the duration was changed to instantaneous from 1 round. It now works on undead as well as creatures who don't understand you and those who your command would be directly harmful to. On the other hand, there's no flexibility on the commands that you can use anymore, whereas previously it used to say that a player can come up with their own commands. They removed that sentence in 2024, so you just had this list of approach, drop, flee, grovel, or halt. It had some text regarding flying creatures on the halt, but they removed that. I don't think it really impacts a whole lot. And much like the Charm Person spell, it no longer requires the additional targets when you upcast the spell to be within 30 feet of each other. They just need to be within the range of the spell when you cast it. I think the limitations on the commands is probably for the better. As much as we like to troll the enemy sometimes by coming up with really ridiculous commands, I think it's just a little more streamlined to do it this way. I do think it is interesting that you can now use this on creatures to whom your command would be harmful, because you can still technically use the approach and flee commands to cause the creature to either walk into or across like a hazardous area or something along those lines. So there's potentially powerful combinations that way. Compelled Duel has been changed a little bit, where the target is no longer able to make additional wisdom saving throws to try to ignore the movement restriction. They just fail the initial saving throw and they're kind of locked into that duel with you. Comprehend Languages was changed to allow you to understand sign language. Create or Destroy Water now has a material component that is both water and sand, rather than water for create water and sand for destroy water. Otherwise, there's no mechanical changes. Cure Wounds was changed to an abjuration spell from Evocation. It no longer excludes undead or constructs, and the number of dice that you roll for the healing was doubled for both the initial casting as well as the upcast scaling. Detect Evil and Good specifically lets you sense if the Hollow spell is active, rather than previously this just sensed if an area was consecrated or desecrated. And then we're going to see a pattern here where spells that were blocked by 3 feet of dirt or wood previously are now only blocked by 1 foot of dirt or wood. On that vein, we have Detect Magic. This is now a magic action to detect the aura on an object instead of just an action. You can only learn the School of Magic if the affected item was affected by a spell. And then again, we can see that it is blocked by 1 foot of dirt or wood rather than 3 feet. Detect Poison and Disease now has nothing to do with disease because they removed all the disease mechanics. You can now detect venomous creatures as well as poisonous creatures, and it also detects magical contagions instead of diseases. And again, like the other spells, this is now blocked by 1 foot of dirt or wood rather than 3 feet of it. The Disguise Self spell no longer states that you can use an action to end it early, but again, like I said, spell duration rules in 2024 said you can end an ongoing spell effect that you created without using any sort of action. So the only real change here is that it requires the study action to investigate the illusion. Dissonant Whispers had a small change here where a deafened creature no longer automatically succeeds against the saving throw. Divine Favor was actually had a pretty powerful change where it was changed from Evocation to Transmutation. That's not the powerful part of it, of course, but it no longer requires concentration. So previously this was a 1 minute concentration spell similar to like a Hunter's Mark, although it's a buff on you that allows all your attacks to deal damage rather than being a buff on enemies that you had to move around with your bonus action like Hunter's Mark. So now that this doesn't require concentration, that is a pretty powerful effect. Divine Smite is now a spell in 2024. It now requires a bonus action when you hit a target. It has a verbal component if that would come up at all. And it works with unarmed strikes, but otherwise it's functionally the same as Divine Smite. Ensnaring Strike has a special bonus action timeline similar to Divine Smite, where previously you would cast this first and then try to hit someone with it to apply it. The strength check to free oneself from the vines now benefits from athletics proficiency, so it's a little easier to free yourself from these. And it now also specifically says that the spell ends when the creature frees themselves from the vines rather than just being free from it. The Entangle spell was now changed that it no longer affects the caster, so if you can cast it around yourself if you're surrounded by enemies and not be subject to the saving throw for it, although you would still be affected by the difficult terrain if you're trying to move through it. And much like in Ensnaring Strike, the strength check to break free now benefits from athletics proficiency. Expeditious Retreat was unchanged. Fairy Fire also unchanged. False Life had a duration change from instantaneous from 1 hour previously. Basically, you're just able to keep your temporary hit points until the end of your next short rest, I believe is how long they last. The number of initial hit points that you get was increased to 2d4 plus 4 from 1d4 plus 4, and the material component changed to a drop of alcohol, rather it was previously a small amount. Featherfall was completely unchanged. Find Familiar has a number of small changes. To begin with, you can now choose any CR0 beast as your familiar. To telepathically link with your familiar to see and hear through their eyes and ears is now a bonus action on your turn to make that connection and maintain it, whereas previously in 2014 rules, this was an action to do so. It is a magic action specifically to dismiss or summon your familiar as long as they haven't been destroyed yet. And the material component used to require burning that 10 gold worth of incense in a brass brazier if you were that specific about it, but it no longer technically does. Fog Cloud was changed to no longer specify the miles per hour or the speed of the wind necessary to disperse it. Goodberry was changed to a conjuration spell from transmutation. The duration changed from instantaneous to 24 hours, although this is no mechanical difference. The Goodberries always lasted 24 hours. However, it is now a bonus action to eat one rather than an action. The Grease spell is unchanged. Guiding Bolt also unchanged. Hail of Thorns now has special timing similar to Divine Smite, where it's something that you do on hit rather than casting it ahead of time and then doing it. So because of that, it is now an instantaneous duration rather than 1 minute with concentration. And then for the upcast scaling, it used to be capped at 60-10, but they no longer have the cap on it. And so if you dipped into Ranger for whatever reason just to get the spell and you were multi-classing into a full caster like a Bard, let's say, you could technically upcast this at higher levels if you really, really wanted to do even more damage. Healing Word was changed to an abjuration spell from an evocation spell. The number of dice was doubled for both the initial cast and the upcast scaling, and it also no longer excludes undead or constructs. Hellish Rebuke is unchanged. Heroism also unchanged. Hex is mostly unchanged, although they did add some upcast scaling. If you cast this at second level, it lasts 4 hours, whereas previously that wasn't available. It just skipped straight to levels 3 and 4. Hunter's Mark now deals 1d6 force damage rather than 1d6 of the damage type of the weapon, and it also now triggers off any attack, not just weapon attacks. Ice Knife was added to the player's handbook from the Elemental Evil player's companion, otherwise it's unchanged. The Identify spell used to require a material component of a pearl worth 100 gold or more and an owl feather, but now it's just the pearl worth 100 gold or more. Again, no real mechanical change, but if that would matter to you, then that is the material component change. Illusory Script is unchanged. Inflict Wounds has kind of had a big fall from grace here. It is now a Constitution saving throw instead of a melee spell attack, and it now only deals 2d10 damage down from 3d10 damage. You know, it is save for half, so you're always guaranteed some damage. I guess maybe that's why they felt the need to reduce the amount of damage, although, again, Constitution saves are the most reliable save for the vast majority of monsters. So I really like the old Inflict Wounds better. I would probably continue using the old ones just because I like it. You know, if you crit with the old Inflict Wounds, it feels very, very good. The changes to jump are actually pretty interesting. So previously this just tripled your jump distance and you would follow the normal rules for the long jump and high jump. But for this one, it is now specifically a bonus action from an action to cast the spell. You must target willing creatures when you cast the spell. It has upcast scaling to target additional creatures for each spell level that you cast it at. And the effect of it now is that the creatures who are affected by the spell can jump 30 feet by spending 10 feet of movement. This is kind of interesting because it's not entirely dissimilar from the rabbit hop from the Herongon species, where they can use a bonus action to jump a number of feet equal to 5 times their proficiency bonus. This one doesn't require a specific action to do, it just requires you to use 10 feet to jump 30 feet. But because this is a specific rule on the spell, I believe it would supersede the long jump and high jump rules that say that you need to spend 1 foot of movement for every foot jumped. So effectively, as long as you jump at least once during your turn, the way I'm reading it, this spell basically increases your total movement by 20 feet because you have to spend 10 feet to jump 30 feet, so you move 20 extra feet, and then you still have the rest of your movement to continue moving after that. I imagine there's probably going to be a lot of people in the comments who disagree with me, but I think I'm right, and even if I'm wrong, I'm probably going to still rule it anyway, because the jump was always sort of a weird thing because the long jump and high jump rules do limit you to your movement. This is more of a specific special action that doesn't require an action, just requires a sacrifice of movement to jump a certain number of feet. Moving on to Long Strider, this is unchanged. Mage Armor, much like many other spells, no longer specifies that it can be dismissed as an action, but again, we know that the spell duration rules have been updated, that this can be dismissed requiring no action. Magic Missile itself is unchanged, but the rule about simultaneous damage changed to affect only spells that have an area of effect, where previously in 2014 you would roll once and then multiply that roll by the number of darts that you had for the spell. In 2024, technically you now would roll independently for each individual dart. Protection from good and evil. The only real change here is that the material component changed to be a flask of holy water worth at least 25 gold, instead of alternatively allowing powdered silver or iron. Purify food and drink no longer specifies disease, as all disease mechanics were removed in 2024. Ray of Sickness was changed to a ranged spell attack from a Constitution saving throw. This actually makes it pretty decent. I mean, it is a single target spell, but it can automatically apply the poison condition if you hit, assuming that the creature isn't immune to the poison condition. So if you're going to be in a setting where there aren't going to be a lot of creatures who are immune to the poison condition, this could actually be pretty useful. The Sanctuary spell now ends if a creature casts any spell, not just a spell that affects an enemy, as well as the material component changed to a shard of glass from a mirror rather than a small silver mirror. I don't like the change where this ends if you cast any spell. I think one of the benefits of Sanctuary is that you could give yourself Sanctuary as sort of a support caster, and then cast support spells on your allies while maintaining Sanctuary. So I don't know that I like this change. I probably would still use the old rules. Searing Smite has been changed to have the special bonus timing action where you do it on hit rather than casting it first and then trying to hit someone with it. So for that reason, the duration no longer has concentration. And an actually pretty powerful buff is that the upcasting for it now not only buffs the initial damage, but also the follow-up burning damage that occurs every round. The shield spell was unchanged. Shield of Faith just had a small material component change, whereas previously it was a small parchment with a bit of holy text written on it, but now it's a prayer scroll, if that matters to you. Again, it's mechanically unchanged. Silent Image is now a magic action to move the image rather than just an action. And much like I imagine we'll see with all the illusions, is that it requires the study action to investigate it rather than just a generic action. The Sleep spell has had a pretty big overhaul, but it's effectively the same kind of spell. Its range was decreased to 60 feet from 90 feet, and the radius of the effect is now 5 feet from 20 feet. The duration now requires concentration. It requires 2 total saving throws. If they fail the first saving throw, they become incapacitated. And then at the end of its next turn, if it's still incapacitated, it has to make the save again, and if it fails that one, then they're unconscious. Previously, this used to just affect a certain number of hit points of creatures. You would roll a certain number of dice, and then however many hit points worth of creatures you could affect, they would fall asleep instantly. This one scales better into higher levels, so it's a little more usable, because usually what you'd do if you picked up sleep, you'd pick it up at level 1 or 2, and then you'd get rid of it at levels 3 or higher usually. And the only other change here is that you used to be able to use a cricket for a material component, but you no longer can. Speak with Animals is basically the same spell, although it now specifically uses the influence action to interact with beasts, and it no longer limits the beast's knowledge by their intelligence. Tasha's Hideous Laughter no longer fails if a creature has an intelligence of 4 or less. Tensor's Floating Disc is unchanged. Thunderous Smite, much like the other Smite spells, now has that special bonus action timing where you do it on hit, and for that reason it has a instantaneous duration with no concentration. And more excitingly, it now has actual upcast scaling, so you can cast this at higher levels and do more damage. Thunderwave is unchanged. Unseen Servant is unchanged. Witchbolt has had its range increased to 60 feet from 30 feet, which is pretty good quality of life change. The initial damage was increased to 2d12 from 1d12, and to do the damage on subsequent turns now requires just your bonus action rather than your action, so that's actually very powerful. And even better, if you miss the initial attack roll to hit them with the initial damage, the effect of the spell still attaches itself to that creature, so you can continue doing the follow-up damage every turn. So not only do you have a longer leash with the spell with 60 feet from 30 feet, the initial damage does more damage, and it's now your bonus action to deal the damage again, so you can use your action to cast a cantrip at them or whatever you're trying to do during that time. All in all, Witchbolt is a much more usable spell in 2024. Then moving on to the last of our first level spells, we have Wrathful Smite. This now has the special bonus action timing of all smites where it's on hit rather than you cast it first and then try to hit someone with it. And then for that reason, the duration no longer requires concentration. The spell school was changed to Necromancy from Evocation. This can now be learned through the Shadow Touched feat. The affected creature now makes a saving throw at the end of their turns rather than requiring an action to try to break the fear effect. And then it now has upcast scaling for additional damage, which is really nice. So that is all the changes for the cantrips and first level spells in Dungeons & Dragons 2024. So let me know down in the comments what you think about all these changes, if there's any 1 or 2 or 3 in specific that you think are interesting, maybe different uses for spells that didn't exist before that now do. What do you think of the jump spell? Do you interpret it the way that I interpret it? I always try to err on the side of something being functional rather than it not working at all. So I think the way that I read it is right. And again, even if I'm not right, I'm going to just interpret it the way that I interpret it if I'm the one playing. But yeah, let me know what you think about all that down in the comments. And again, while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you're a new viewer or a returning viewer to this channel and you liked what you saw here, like the format, and you want to see more, please hit that subscribe button. Again, we're on our way to that first benchmark of 1,000 subscribers, so that's very exciting. I have new videos coming out every Wednesday and Saturday. I'm probably going to try to continue this series going forward if I have the time to do so. Again, it should get easier as we get higher in levels because there's less spells. This was certainly the lion's share of them, so this will be my longest video of this series for sure. I'm going to put this all down in a playlist so you can kind of refer back to it if you want to. But again, I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.